Hey, what's going on, good people? It's Gardner Douglas, your oyster ninja. I'm here today with someone different. You know, we usually keep it to oysters, but today I got Sean from Montauk Seaweed Supply. Uh, we were just laughing because it's hard to I can't read. I can't read. I'm saying everything but Montauk. But yeah, Montauk Seaweed Supply. And what's going on, Sean?
What's up, my man? Great to see you. Great to be here on a Friday with the Oyster Ninja.
Yeah, my man. So you're in Long Island, right?
Correct. Yep. We're due east of New York City, and we're headquartered in Montauk, New York, which is the very end of Long Island. The end, they refer to it as. So if you just kept going and hit the point where you couldn't go any further, you're in Montauk.
Montauk, nice, nice, nice. So what else is Montauk known for?
Oh, great question. I mean, Montauk has a very long history. The word Montauk originally comes from the Montaukett Native American tribe that was there. And so it's really, though, since colonial times and pre-colonial times, it's been a very fishing oriented location. So it sits, if you can imagine, it's a point of land that kind of juts out, and it's the confluence of three bodies of water. So the Atlantic Ocean and the Long Island Sound and the Block Island Sound all meet right off the point there. So as you know, in the oceans and the seafood world, anytime you have kind of like bays and oceans and things mixing and coming together like that, it makes for a very interesting, usually fishing scene. So Montauk is currently and has been New York State's largest commercial fishing port. And I would say that really is the historical identity of Montauk. It's really known for fishing. But over the last 10 to 20 years, it's really gotten kind of like commercialized and a lot of more high-end residential. The identity has changed over the last maybe 20 to 30 years, from like a kind of rough and tumble fishing village to now it's really like a glitzy, glamorous, you got a lot of Range Rovers and rich folks driving around. So that makes for interesting scenes at the bar at night for sure.
I could imagine. I could imagine.
Yeah.
So we'll come back to Montauk, but just tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into the industry.
Yeah, great question. So I grew up, my parents, tell the story. They're like that I basically was obsessed and loved fishing from my earliest age, that they would have, they would send me away to basketball camp and I would come home with best fisherman trophy. And so my earliest memories really are fishing in Shinnecock and Hampton Bays, which is about 40 miles to the west of Montauk, but that's the second largest commercial fishing port in New York State. So it's one of those things, Gardner, where like I just loved fish and seafood for as long back as I can remember. I can't really put my finger on I was so young. Like I look at photos and things when I was like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and all I was doing was fishing and holding fish and, loved seafood. So from there, it really just became a quest of, I just, any spare time or free time I had, I was fishing. A lot of my friends became commercial fishermen, and I love seafood. And I think I got an interesting glimpse and was able to see the marketplace over the 1980s and 90s and into the early 2000s, change right before my eyes. So that kind of drove me to think like, how can we reconnect? We had this big disconnect basically happen with imports and things, as you've seen. Anyone working in the seafood industry knows that the previously local conversation kind of turned into an import conversation. And so that drove me to try to find solutions to that. Like, how could we bring it back to simpler times where like, you knew your local fishermen, where you source seafood that was seasonal and that was like local and that was, abundant and all those basic things that we had grown up on. So that drove me ultimately to start Long Island's first community supported fishery project, Dock to Dish, a little over 10-ish years ago. I mean, we were doing that, exercise, like basically delivering fresh fish to our friends and family in restaurants. But about 10 or 11 years ago, somewhere around there, we formally launched New York State's first community supported fishery, which quickly turned into the first restaurant supported fishery in the country. And then that took off like a rocket ship. We ended up doing restaurant supported fishery programs in New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., down at the salt line with those guys, and down through Central America. We ended up bringing this model to like Fiji, South Africa, helping people all over the world set up these community supported and restaurant supported fishery programs. And it really has been just a kind of a magic carpet ride ever since. Do what you love and love what you do, as they say.
No doubt.
That's what got me to where I am today.
So what does that actually mean? Can you break that down like so Barney style? It doesn't make sense, like a community supported fishery.
Yeah. It's, I think it was new at the time, but now there's a number of them existing all over the place. But basically, community, where we got the idea from was community supported agriculture and a CSA. And what that is like instead of going to the local market or the shop or the store, you actually go to a farm and pay a membership fee up front for a season's worth of fresh farm produce. So it's interesting because it's kind of like a radically different model than most Americans are used to in the era of Amazon. Most people are used to just clicking whatever they want on their doorstep the next day, and demand is how the whole market kind of runs. In a CSA model, you surrender your right to ask for anything or demand anything, and you then kind of are at the mercy of what the farmer gives you in your box every week. So the trade-off is you're not able to ask for anything or make any requests, but what you do get is like the most delicious in season, perfectly, like the flavors are off the charts. It's like what the farmer's family would be eating. And so once people start to experience that, they typically, and then it puts you into synchronized with the seasons and the rhythm of, you know, local produce. So we saw that model starting to work like in our local neighborhood in Amagansett. There had been a CSA program for almost 30 years. And I went and met with the farmer, the guy who started, Scott Chasky, and asked him, like, do you think this would work for fish? Like, what if we had people sign up for a season of fresh seafood, and then they just came, and basically that's exactly how we did it. They came and picked up their vegetable box at the farm every week, and we had coolers of fresh fish fillets there for the members. So they got their veggies and their fish in one shot, and the same rules applied. They had to pay in advance. They had to be willing to accept whatever, like a true catch of the day, whatever came off the dock that day, right. Which was a real interesting experience for a lot of folks. When, you know, we had sea robins, we had a lot, you know, it was what was really landing. So they got everything from the, you know, the hits, striped bass and rockfish, as you guys call it down there. When it was tuna season, we got some tuna steaks in there and stuff, but early in the season they were getting things like monkfish or you know, stuff that they weren't necessarily that accustomed to. And so it was a big education process, but it also, what really changed it all was we had some chefs here in New York, Chef Dan Barber at Blue Hill, specifically Chef Joe Romuto at Nick and Tony's. Once they got kind of wind of this idea that they could sign up for, you know, basically a membership in the local fishery, that's when, Gardner, that concept took off like a rocket ship, and we moved into wholesale. So we no longer had to do fillets and coolers. We were just running, you know, refrigerated van loads of fish straight from the boats directly to the restaurants. And as simple as a concept as that might seem, it was like radically different than what anyone had been used to, because we had over the years become so accustomed to this demand marketplace and sourcing seafood from all over the planet. So the whole goal of either a CSA or a community supported agriculture program or a community supported fishery program is to reduce the chain of custody, like how many people actually touch the good when it goes, you know, in the course, when it leaves the fisherman's hands or the farmer's hands, how many people are in the chain of custody before it gets to the consumer. Our whole goal was just to get that down to 3. So it was basically just, you know, fisherman, delivery guy, chef, or fisherman, you know, member basically of the cooperative. And yeah, man, it was like a totally wild, unexpectedly international success story that, you know, to this day is like Hook to Cook, South Africa. They're still running their programs down there. The New York program, the Montauk program here, we had to make major adjustments when COVID hit, because we had, if you can believe it, like the Google Corporation, big New York City corporations that were members, and once they sent all their employees home, we had to shut the wholesale program down.
Right.
So, but yeah, that's basically where it was, what happened, and where we are now.
That's pretty cool. So, like, was it like increments, I guess? Like, if you pay this much, you get this amount of weight, this many pounds, or?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep, exactly. So it would start at an individual level was 2 pounds of fillets per week. Family level was 4 pounds of fillets per week. And then restaurant level started at 50 pounds of whole fish per week. But that went all the way up to Google at the end was at like a ton. They were taking 2,000. Yeah, they have 7,000 employees on their campus. So you know, they would go through a lot of fish, but yeah, it just exactly, it was incremental, and then it grew and expanded. And now the model is everywhere. I just got a text a little while ago from our buddy Captain Hodge out in Santa Barbara. He does a whole Dr. Dish program in Los Angeles, Vancouver, like all these harbor towns, basically, because the same problems existed all over the place with this disconnect and the globalization of seafood. So this little idea that we borrowed from the farmers to try to translate community supported agriculture into fisheries, it was totally an experiment. And we were like, oh, we'll see. How they say, like, necessity is the mother of invention or something like that. Like, but it turns out that this was a necessity in many harbor towns all over. DC kicked one off. The guys at the Saw Line have a restaurant supported fishery program going for a couple of years. And they were having all types of fishermen running through that place. You know, and the same exact model. The chef there, Kyle Bailey, he came out of Dan Barber's kitchen. So he was very accustomed to, you know, it's a lot when the chefs aren't able to demand or tell you what they want, and they have to just be willing to whatever's coming to the door. That keeps them on their toes. They have to be, like, you know, spontaneous and coming up a lot of times out of their comfort zone and figuring things out on the fly. Yeah, it keeps them very sharp.
Yeah, that's what's up, man. I got the ball rolling now. I'm thinking I might make something.
Yeah. You can do it with oysters too. We've seen oyster community supported oyster farms programs like that, where people sign up for a season and then you hand select the best of the best, and then they trust. You know, it's really trust bonds, reestablishing you know, trust bonds in the chain of custody that really don't exist elsewhere. But you could do it if you're interested. We'd be happy to help you out. I mean, we got a lot of experience doing community supported fishery work.
I like the way you talk, man. I gotta ask you a question, man. This is I didn't have this question wrote down, but it's hitting me now since, you know, you was talking about the fisheries and stuff, man. Did you watch Seaspiracy?
Yes, I saw it.
Okay,
that was
all right.
So I was I think, you know, I always look at the source, right? Like, where is this information coming from? And I had already seen Cowspiracy. Like the first, you know, part one of that, and it's a bunch of, like, vegan activists who are, you know, who don't think people should be eating any beef or pork or chicken or fish. And so I thought there was little sparks of truth in there, but I immediately was like, this is a very manipulated story. And, like, then as I continued to watch Seaspiracy, I was like, okay, this is pretty much propaganda for a full on, which I think was really unfortunate, you know, because the realities of the world are really different than what Seaspiracy presented. And, you know, I think over 1 billion people on the planet right now rely on seafood as their primary source of protein. So I think, once again, you know, like we were talking about earlier, just about, you know, who can afford certain things. Being a vegan is really expensive, like, you know, and in the US, I think where Seaspiracy was made with United States filmmakers and an American mentality, you know, it very much, I think, casts shame on people small scale community fisheries around the world who, you know, it shined a bright light on the worst of these big industrial fisheries and, like, you know, and maybe these black market illegal things that go on. But that's not representative of the whole. So I thought it was a really biased and manipulated, 2 thumbs down on Seaspiracy was my feeling. But
Right.
what'd you think?
So yeah, I'm in the same boat. My thing was you know, they basically were telling people don't eat fish, you know, don't eat fish, cut it out. You know, it's not good enough to just go sustainable or what we think is a sustainable or reliable source. You can't trust those people. Don't eat fish. You know, so I'm like, you know, it's no way I could, you know, stand behind it because, you know, I'm from the Eastern Shore, you know, so I grew up on fish. It's no way I can give up seafood, period. Anyway, it's just not possible. Again, they made some good points, like, you know, as far as like the trash, you know, the big trash in the ocean.
Pacific, yeah.
Right. Of course, you know, doing the whole sharks and dolphins. They made good points. But you can't just not eat seafood. You can't just not eat fish. In my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that was the goal, to scare people away from eating fish or seafood whatsoever. And that's
Right.
just, yeah, it's not a reality for people living on the planet Earth.
And that was just like that other show on Netflix. I don't know, it had people going vegan for a while. Like I forgot what it was called, but um I don't know. I guess it was like saying everything bad that meat does to your body and a whole bunch of other stuff. I don't remember what it was called, but I remember like once people saw it, they was like, I didn't watch it, but my wife watched and she went vegan for a couple weeks, you know. So, you know.
Yeah, it has an impact. It definitely, it has an impact. Movies
Right.
like that can leave a lasting impression on people. And like, it's interesting. I was probably, I mean, oh man, a very long time ago. I was only in 8th grade, but we visited the National Mall, and there was a tent set up for I was in the 8th grade, about, so maybe like 12 or 13 years old, and I loved fish. I loved animals, and there was this huge tent set up on the National Mall, and my family was going to the Smithsonian, Air and Space, and I had just been there on a class trip like 2 months earlier. So I asked my parents, can I go to this animal tent? There was a couple of like college girls outside who were like, do you love animals? Do you like animals? And I was like, I love animals. And they were like, okay, come in here. And I was like, okay. And my mom said, so long, you can go, but she made them promise, just don't let him leave here until we come back. We're going to be in this museum for about an hour and a half. And they were like, we promise, we will not let him leave. And I didn't know what PETA was. It was the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And Gardner, they put me into a shock and awe, like slaughterhouses. They said, I was like, oh, like I left there so traumatized that I was a vegan from like
Yeah.
the age of 14, 15, and then I went back to fish. And then ultimately I relapsed on a hot dog a few years later. So and then I went back to being an omnivore, I think they call her. So just eating pretty much everything. But I think movies, you know, they and like Seaspiracy, or those kind of shock movies that can really make people like, holy really scare you. I don't know, it's really tough when I see them doing that for seafood, because ultimately, especially when you get into the realm of like what you're doing, I mean, when you get into oyster farming or regenerative restorative aquaculture, it's hard to beat that as from a sustainability perspective, right? And so I feel like they just use a broad brush in Seaspiracy and just kind of painted any food that comes out of the ocean as evil and bad. And that's just not that's not the reality of it. And I think when they do that, there's a lot of other effects, but one of them is they push people back towards hamburgers, which is from a carbon footprint and all the things that they're trying to make it sound like in their movie that they're standing for, climate and clean environment and stuff like that. I don't know that they fully thought through a lot of the repercussions of the messaging in that film.
Well, you know, it's really a shame, and I don't want to drag this out, but I do want to say, you know, they still have a platform, you know, and they held everybody's attention, and of course it was trending and everything. So you know, I just wish they had pushed a more positive note, you know, that could have maybe led to something else. I mean, you know, with recycling and you know, carbon footprint and you know, all that good stuff. But you know, I don't know. Let's get to Montauk, man. Montauk
All right, cool.
Supply. So just tell us about, you know, your business and what you got going on, man.
Yeah. So it's interesting how this all began. So we started a community sport fishery over 10 years ago, and a big part of that, as you know, in the seafood world is especially in the mid-Atlantic region where we are. So when you get into fish processing, there's a lot of waste. The average, you know, like the average yield for round fin fish in the mid-Atlantic is around 40%. So what that means is if I have 100 pounds of black sea bass, for example, and I fillet out 100 pounds of whole fish, I end up with 40 pounds of fillet and 60 pounds of waste. So when you start to scale up, and now we're dealing with 1,000 pounds and 2,000 pounds, that waste really starts to, you're looking at the, you know, the dumpster in the parking lot outside the fillet house, and you're like, man, that's a huge amount of just wasted fish. And it's a lot of things like, you know, still in the waste, you'd have a lot of whether it was fish collars, cheeks, all the taco cuts in the racks and things like that, which still, you know, is very good seafood. It's just Americans only want to eat fillets, right? And they don't like whole fish, and they really, Americans for the most part are not a very seafood centric culture, and we don't have a very extravagant palate like they do in other parts of the world for seafood. So so that turned the light on for us, that like, how do we solve this seafood waste problem? So we started this project where we started bringing the fish waste to the local farms and turning it into composting it and turning it into a fertilizer for the local farms. And we really started to track and explore what would it look like if we started to create, you know, this is 2013 or 2014, where we started to create a secondary almost business of fish waste fertilizer. So that then led to two things happening at once. I was really tracking the local seafood kelp farming kind of industry, which was very fledgling in the US at that time, especially on the East Coast. And we also started having really bad nitrogen loading problems in Eastern Long Island. So not so much Montauk because we have so much water flow from the ocean, but in a lot of the bays and estuaries, kind of like the Chesapeake, anywhere where you have an enclosed body of water, we started having these nitrogen runoff problems, and it was killing, like, you know, like our bay scallops, the lobster all left, all the winter flounder, like all the bays and waterways started getting destroyed. So we started just connecting these dots. So how can we make, you know, like try to solve a few of these problems at once? And then the light turned on, you know, that what if we had these kelp farms, which act as like nitrogen sinks. Basically the kelp soaks up a lot of the nitrogen from the waterway. And then what if we can take that kelp out and convert it into fertilizer products and stop importing all this synthetic fertilizer from all over the place? And so it was basically, once again, like a gradual step-by-step thing that brought us to last year, 2020. And we decided, like, let's go for it, man. We've got all the parts that we need here, all the pieces to the puzzle. Let's put together, we really just had to formalize it and launch. And I think now what we've, you know, it's always interesting when you start something brand new. We have something we call the Crab Basket Society in a lot of ways. So, you know, from like Main Avenue, if you have a basket of Maryland number 2s, and one of them starts crawling up over the side, the other ones will reach up and hold on to him and pull him back down, you know? Right. And that's to a degree, we kind of had a lot of people like, what do you guys think you're doing? Trying to make, you know, fertilizer out of seaweed? we're in that phase right now, and we've been through this before. We're that crab basket society where people are like, you know, they're not quite sure what's going on or what's happening, so they'll try to naysay it often. But then we've got a huge waves of support from a lot of people who can, you know, see what we're trying to do and understand. And I'm happy to report that, like, we launched and now we're off and running and sailing. We've got a couple of good local kelp farmers who we're now helping them seed their upcoming kelp farms for this upcoming season. We have a couple of local wild kelp or seaweed harvesters, these old Montauk families who, you know, go back 300 years. They do a very kind of regenerative pruning of wild seaweeds. And now we're starting, this is super exciting for us. We're starting to go back to our original blueprint and take waste stream things out of the commercial fishery and start to blend those together with the kelp meal to create these new blends of, like, our first one is a sea scallop shell, which is all calcium. We're learning how to pulverize and powder those and mix them with the kelp meal, which is also kind of a ground and pulverized. And the results for the gardeners and the farmers and the wine, you know, the vintners and the vineyards and even arborists and a lot of landscapers and stuff, we're finding all these different outlets for these products, and people are just like, whoa, man, this was our first summer where we gave out huge amounts of samples last spring as the season began, like the gardening and farming season out here. And now, like in the last few weeks, we started to get all these pictures and videos coming back of the people who used our kelp meal fertilizer in their home gardens or to transplant trees, whatever they did. And all these, like, it looks like, you know, Jurassic Park, man, just these huge, beautiful fruits and vegetables and plants. And people are just astonished by, like, 16-foot tall corn stalks and things that they're like, I've never had this amount of, you know, grapes growing. It causes more branches, it causes deeper roots. Like putting kelp, it turns out, into your soil has like some magical effects. And so, yeah, man, it's like, it feels like going back in the day to when we first launched community supported fisheries, and we're like, whoa, this works.
Right.
You know, it's like, cool, and this works.
So you guys, I guess, have a host of kelp farmers that you get kelp from, and then you guys turn that kelp into fertilizer, and then folks come to you for the fertilizer, then they use that fertilizer and they just grow some awesome crops, flowers, plants, whatever.
Exactly. And so that really creates a closed loop system where, like, because the soil that they're putting the fertilizer into, inevitably the nitrogen and things start to leach into the soil. It gets into the water table and then gets back into the local waterways. So the whole magic of this system is that instead of us continuing to import these synthetic fertilizers from outside the area, flood the ground with those, and then kill the water with them, the kelp farms are sucking that nitrogen up, and then we're putting it back into the soil. It's leaching back into the water. The kelp farms are sucking it up. So it creates a closed loop. And that ultimately, like, you know, we're working with a lot of good scientists here too, and folks at the university, Stony Brook University, especially Cornell University. And they're all kind of saying, like, this is not going to solve all the problems, but if we scale this idea up, it's going to have a very serious beneficial impact on the nitrogen situation, which is our primary concern. And kind of a bonus of that is all this crazy cool growth that the gardeners and farmers are seeing, that they're like, whoa, you know. What's even really cooler than all of that is this is, once again, just like an old time idea. Like if you go back in the history books, like all throughout Europe, Africa, all over the Caribbean, everywhere you go, people had been using kelp and seaweed fertilizers, you know, out in the Pacific Islands, everywhere we look, like, and you look in the deep history and you'll find like indigenous folks and, you know, they've all been, they all knew that kelp and seaweeds were a very valuable source of food, medicine, and fertilizer as a way to make their crops, stronger and grow more fruit or whatever they're trying to grow. It's like one of those cool things. It's like what's old is new again.
So are you guys still part of the Safe Seaweed Coalition?
Yeah. We work with those guys. That's a good click. So cool to have, like, we work in a hyper local space, a very small community. And then sometimes you can kind of get lost in there with your work, and it's hard to have a good perspective on different things. And so the Safe Seaweed Coalition was put together by United Nations. We actually serve on their traceability task force. And it's the coolest thing because they bring people from all over the world. I think there's about 18 folks on our task force alone, and probably 15 different countries represented there. And so everyone brings their ideas, their experience, and like shares what's working and what's not working. And it just gives us such a good elevated perspective, on the work that we're doing. And without that, you end up like, it's very easy to just kind of start running in circles if you're not getting good information, sharing information, hearing success stories and failures from all over the world, and kind of keeping up with that. We're making some good friends on there too from all over the place. It's interesting, just like seafood, just like you and I, if we have a shared love for something, there's a cool kind of bond there where we're finding that with folks in the seaweed and kelp world too, that not everybody loves kelp and seaweed or thinks it's interesting and fun to talk about or work with, but there is a small percentage of people who do. And when you connect and get together with those folks, it's kind of a cool little community of, like, surprisingly, we have a lot of good laughs.
I can imagine, especially like, just I guess culturally, differences, always bring up good laughs. Question for you though. What's like, I guess when somebody just wanders in, like, or do people do they come looking for you, or do you have those people like, oh, what is this? Why should I try? Like, what's always like a selling point to use your product?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we do traditional kind of like, we have a website and we do some social media advertising, but our experience in the past has been, especially in this day and age, when there's so much media flooding people and information, and like their phones, just, you're constantly being bombarded with information and a lot of things that are trying to be sold to you, that
Right.
it kind of really makes that space, it's a tricky space to break through to folks. So we have taken an approach which has worked for us in the past, and we start very, very small. We start with our very close community, friends, family. We start pilot programs. We do a lot of like samples, a lot of feedback, and kind of bring the whole community and get them involved. And like I was saying with the seafood situation, like there's heavy trust bonds built into those relationships with people that people in your community, friends, family. So inevitably from there, it's almost like rings in a pond. It starts to, word of mouth starts to spread, like these are good folks, this is a good product. And then that word of mouth, like, for example, you or I might see a Twitter ad, a Facebook ad, a billboard on the side of the highway, a ad in the back of a magazine, and we may hear the same advertisement on the back of the radio, right? That's all telling us to do the same thing. Go out and buy whatever it may be, right? The thing. But none of those are going to have the impact on us as if you call me up and say, Sean, I found this incredibly cool thing and you should try it. I think you're going to like it. The odds of me then trying that because you told me and I trust you and I know that's good information is like orders of magnitude. All those other, the Twitter, the Facebook, the magazine, the radio, the billboard, if you get all those things up together, is not as powerful as you and I having a trusting relationship and you giving information to me and saying, try this, it's good. That's the holy grail right there. So that's where we focus all of our energies and efforts, really, is to connect with, with our immediate community at first, and make sure that, you also got to make sure that this product is what you're saying it is. And who's going to let you know that better than your friends and family, right? They're going to tell
No,
you
that's
straight,
true. That's very true.
So
They're not gonna be holding back much. Yo, this
not
is
at
some
all.
garbage. What are you doing?
Yes.
Start over.
Exactly. And we have, go through some of those. They'll tell us like, you need to improve this, or I'd like to see this a little bit, and give you all these different ideas that ultimately is for us how you come to a really good product. Is sometimes I feel like it may appear as if there's only one or two people connected to it, but the reality for us is that there is a big, deep community of folks who are working on these things with us, and I think that's ultimately where our sales channels start to get built, is from those communities.
Why should people be using kelp for fertilizer?
Such a good question. So there's a broader picture, which is that kelp is one of the great antidotes to climate change. Kelp farms sequester about 5 times more carbon from the atmosphere than land-based plants. So it's really important that we start farming kelp and pulling a lot of this carbon out of the atmosphere. As everybody knows, the climate is changing. That's being caused by too much carbon being put into the atmosphere. So we need to A, stop producing so much carbon, but B, also start capturing some of the carbon that's out there. So on a global scale, carbon capture would be the #1 reason why people want to start advocating and using kelp-based products. But if you bring it home to, and that's, all over the planet, people are farming kelp and have been for, the US is just really far behind in this space. In Asia and other places of the world, Norway, they've been farming kelp for, 100 years or more, some places. And so now it's being recognized, though, as this great antidote to climate change, that kelp farming can really have a very serious impact on carbon capture and sequestering carbon. But for the fertilizer piece, in order for the whole kind of kelp business economic model, the business models for kelp farmers to really be able to sustain themselves and flourish, there's basically 3 F's in the kelp world. It's that why you would farm kelp and grow it: food, fertilizer, and fuel. And so we have now on the East Coast a whole bunch of folks who are growing kelp for food purposes. So like Atlantic Sea Farms in Maine, they just landed last year 850,000 pounds of farmed kelp, and they're estimated to grow in the next, like, doubling that and tripling that year over year. So they're growing kelp for food up in the deep, clean, cold waters of Maine. But the situation as you move a little further south in New England into Connecticut and especially New York is that the kelp farmers don't really have a full market for their entire crop. So they end up back to that waste conversation. They end up with like 60% of their crop is good enough to sell for culinary grade for food, but then they have 40% of their crop that is really no value. They can't sell it into that food category. And there currently is no farmed kelp fertilizer category. So we're really kind of designing our program to come in and be the purchaser of all that waste stream kelp, farm kelp that otherwise couldn't get used. And if you don't find a way to sell that other 30 or 40%, similarly, like back in the fish situation where we were figuring out all this waste from the fish, what do we do with it? It's the same story with kelp farms. And so to answer your question, the reason why people should be using kelp fertilizer is because that's really, we're going to support the kelp farmers and allow this whole kind of community of kelp farmers up and down the coast to survive and thrive and really have that bigger carbon capture impact that we need to start fighting back against climate change. So it's a small action, people just switching their fertilizer to a kelp-based fertilizer, but it actually has enormous impacts into the coastal economy and keeping these kelp farms going and growing, which we need them to.
So I'm not sure if you heard my episode with Stonington Kelp Farm.
Susie Flores, she's the
Ooh, yeah.
best. Yeah, yeah.
So that was my first introduction to kelp. And see, first of all, before I want you to answer, is there a difference between kelp and seaweed? But I just wanted to say why I brought that up is so they introduced me to sugar kelp. So I'm wondering, like, is there a particular kelp that you use for fertilizer versus eating, or does it matter, or is it the same thing? Or
Yeah, yeah, great. So I think first of all, it's so interesting and no coincidences, but Susie Flores and Stonington Kelp Company this past year brought us all of their waste stream kelp, and that's how we'll be making our Regency product with Susie. So on our labels, we have a QR code. If you access that QR code, it comes up Susie's story, and you can trace it back our products to Susie's farm, and that's
nice.
exactly yeah, yeah. So she's a rock star. She's fantastic, Susie. And I think there's around the globe in the range of about 10,000 different species of seaweed. So when we talk locally about farming kelp, we're only working with sugar kelp. And so to answer your question, there are different as far as like what's edible, what's what's delicious, what's poisonous, what makes better fertilizer, what makes better fuels. There are all different categories. They typically do it by color, by the red seaweeds, the brown seaweeds, the green seaweeds, and each of them have different kind of attributes or things that would make them more beneficial for to be grown for a food, or grown for fertilizer, or grown for fuel purposes. But what we're working with here is sugar kelp, and that's a native species that naturally grows along the East Coast. And that's a really important part of all this, is that you don't want to introduce any type of invasive species or things like that. And then there's a whole host of reasons why, like sugar kelp grows in the wintertime and then dies off when the water warms in the summer months.
Mhm.
So it actually serves as like an alternate growing season for the oyster farmers and creates a dual season situation. So that's really important. But the reality is, and we kind of get a little bit of really hardcore industry insiders right now. There's a lot of the kelp space is in the nonprofit world or the research, academic research space on the East Coast. We're like Susie's a good example. Atlantic Sea Farms is another great example. We're the first in New York to actually begin a business, to start a small business in the kelp space. And it's really it's impossible, as far as we know right now, to be able to do that with just farmed kelp. Mm-hmm. So we're using a limited amount of wild harvest, but there are a number of folks, we work really closely with seagrass specialists from Cornell University, the Department of Environmental Conservation. Like, we've got a whole host of folks that we worked with for years and supervise and advise on our harvesting techniques. But what we harvest wild is a species called Ascophyllum nodosum, and that's completely different than sugar kelp. If you ever look at sugar kelp, it's kind of a green, flowy, it's brown in the water, but it's green when you cook it. A green, flowy type of like frond. It's almost like a huge long leaf, looks like a lasagna noodle.
Right.
But Ascophyllum nodosum rockweed is what you would see more like attached to rocks, and it's got little. It's amazing how evolution works, man. It's got little bubbles in it that when the tide comes in, it raises them up so they stand up and they can access sunlight better. But it makes for you ever see the little like it's kind of like where you'd always see seaweed look like the little fingers sticking up, little knobby kind of air sacs in there. That's a totally separate species that is year round. That is available year round, unlike sugar kelp. And so there are dramatic differences in all of these. I think in the Long Island Sound region where we are, there's over 250 different species just in the Long Island Sound. And we have not really explored any of these, as far as like, two, basically, sugar kelp and Ascophyllum nodosum. And that's as far as we've gotten so far. So it's almost like botanical gardens of different species when you get underwater. And, you know, historically, myself and yourself, a lot of the seafood guys, we've only really thought of fish in the ocean or shellfish in the ocean. This is going down to the next level, like the bottom of that's pyramid that you see in the ocean with the sharks at the top, and you know the trophic scale. All the way at the bottom is the greens and the vegetations and the seaweeds, and it's just a whole unexplored world where I think in the next 10, 20, 50 years, we have to start looking to ocean farmed vegetation like seaweeds and kelps to solve a lot of these earthly problems on land that we've created.
No doubt. It makes sense, man. Makes sense. That's all I got for you, man. I'm not gonna keep you, man.
Cool, man. This was fun. I think we should do this more often. I love just catching up with you about seafood, shellfish, kelp, seaweed. I mean, this is our jam. So, you know, and like I said, man, we're really impressed with your work. We're cheering and applauding you.
Cool.
I think,
thank you.
Yeah, just great work with Oyster Ninja, man. It's just got such good spirit and good vibes and like good energy. So you got big fans up here in New York, big Oyster Ninja fans in Montauk.
Thank you, man. It's all about the vibe, man. It's like even when I'm putting like the little reels together and so I'm like, what vibe does this give off? You know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate you, man. And I guess any last words for the listeners, and of course, you know, how they can get in contact with you, and anything else you want to add.
That's it, man. We're just trying to get by with a little kelp from our friends. You're a pun man, so I know you'll like that one. And get after some Oyster Ninja catering any chance you get, man. We love the work you're doing and love to see people supporting that. You can find us at montaukseaweed.com. We got a ton of interesting info on our website and on Instagram. But other than that, stay peaceful, stay safe, everybody, and eat plenty of oysters.
No doubt, no doubt.